I'd like to talk a little bit about the comedian harmonist set that the Alexandria Harmonizers are going to do at International this July in St. Louis. When Midwinter was in New York City a few years ago, the show Harmony was running on Broadway. A few barbershoppers went to see it. I was not one of them. I hadn't heard much about it, but it didn't seem like the sort of thing I'd want to go and see. But then so many people that did go, whose opinions I trusted, raved about it. They described it as life-changing. And I decided I wanted to go see it, but shortly after that, the production actually closed. It only ran for, I think, 6 weeks. So I was very sad that I didn't get to see it. And Joe Cerruti, the director of the Harmonizers, was one of the people that did go to see it, and he raved about it to me. In fact, he so much fell in love with the show and the story of the comedian harmonists that he told me he wanted to bring that story to the Barbershop Harmony Society, and the way he wanted to do that was with a contest set that the Harmonizers would perform. And he asked me if I would be willing to write the arrangements for that. I had written similar type of arrangements for the Northern Lights in the past, and so he thought this might be something that I'd be well suited to do. And I am so glad, whatever the reason was, that he asked me to be part of this project. But Joe said, I don't want you to just listen to the cast recording. I think you need to experience watching the show. That was a challenge because the show was no longer running. So we did some digging. Mostly Joe did some research on this and discovered that there is a New York City library that stores archives of all the shows that have run on Broadway. Not while they're running, but afterwards you can go and book a time slot and a particular show and go in and watch this. I had to do a little bit of work to enable two people who were not residents of New York City to do this. We had to get New York City library cards. Joe talked to them and explained who we were and what we were doing. But ultimately, he and I were together in Boston with some friends. We decided we would just drive from there to New York City, and we had booked a showing. So we just sat in the library at a cubicle with a screen in front of each of our chairs and watched this show. You would think you wouldn't get nearly as much impact from that, and I'm sure that it wasn't the same as seeing it live. I was really, really impacted by watching this. And I came away understanding why all these people who I trust were so moved by the show. So I was in. I definitely wanted to be part of this project. And then Joe turned me on to the podcast series that talked about each of the members of the Comedian Harmonists. And you may have already seen that. If you haven't, look it up. I became obsessed. And so I went through that whole series, learning about each of the 6 members and their friends and family and the circumstances. It was pretty fascinating. And I was a fan. And what was really striking to me is the fact that I'm a harmony singer, as are probably many of you that'll be watching this. And I'd never heard of them. I had no idea who this group was. And when I came to learn how big they were, we mentioned in the set that they were as big as the Beatles, because to me that gives a sense of scope. And to think that the Beatles were just 20 to 30 years after them, and yet we have all of these recordings of the Beatles. We have the films that they made. We have documentaries that shows them in the creative process in the recording studio. We have interviews, books written about them. We all know who the Beatles are, even many people who are watching this who I'm sure were born well after the Beatles' last performance. But we don't have that for the comedian harmonists, in large part because their recordings were destroyed and their films were destroyed. But very little of that has survived. I happily came on board. And then we talked about the way this set would be shaped, because we're kind of taking the music from a Broadway musical, but not exactly retelling the story of the musical. The musical took some artistic liberties. They added in some additional love interests and that sort of thing that weren't historically accurate. And we wanted this to be historically accurate. We were using the music to tell the story accurately, so the people that saw it would learn about the comedian harmonists and hopefully fall in love with them the way we had. And also, Joe has a good many friends in Europe and in Germany, where there is still a following for the comedian harmonists, much more than there is in North America. And he felt it was very important to portray this accurately, to honor them and honor their memory. The first challenge I came across as an arranger is an obvious one. They were a 6-part vocal group. Sometimes they sang 5 parts and one of them played piano. A lot of the stuff was 6-part a cappella, and Barbershop harmony is a 4-part style. This is a very, very important feature of our style. If we were to have more than 4 parts in a contest song, there would be serious penalties involved in that. So obviously, we wanted to try to portray what it was like to have the comedian harmonists there without ever violating having more than 4 parts. And so there's a spot early in the first song where the harmonists each have an entry, so 6 of them. But what we do is, by the time the 5th one and 6th one come in, some of the earlier ones have moved on to a different note and they're doubling with somebody else. So it creates the illusion of 6 parts, but it never actually exceeds 4 parts as required in Barbershop. One of the other things with Broadway orchestration, it can take turns and go off, and there can be a main song and they can interpolate all this storytelling and development, introducing the characters that can go on for a long, long time, something like 2-hour show. And we need to boil that down to a set that's going to be in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 minutes. I have to cut the music down a lot and be very specific as to what we use. Also, in a Broadway show, you have the texture and interest of an orchestra that is in the background, and this is a cappella music. So we need to create a lot more of the musical interest just with the harmonies. Ironically, one of the songs is called Harmony, but the harmonies chosen in the Broadway show weren't all that adventurous and playful. So I thought it was important that as this thing went along and was celebrating harmony, that we harmonized it in different surprising ways, hopefully delightfully surprising ways, just to kind of lean into that whole idea of celebrating harmony. In Barbershop Contest, we do a 2-song set, and we wanted to basically tell the story of the harmonists. So at the beginning, we introduce each of the characters, right from the idea of taking out an ad in the paper, the founder of the group looking for harmony singers. And then as each person arrives, just saying a few words about them. And you hear the music start, at first it's just 1 part and then 2 parts and 3 parts. So it kind of is portraying the formation of the group. And then once the group is assembled, we interpolate a couple of routines that were similar to what they had done. These are other songs from the Broadway musical, which is not the actual music that the harmonists sang. All the music in the show was actually written by Barry Manilow and Bruce Sussman, written to portray the types of performances they would do. As you might imagine from their name, they had a fair bit of humor in what they would do. And so one of the songs is a comedic routine where they apparently dressed as waiters and sang while acting as waiters and moving around with, trays and napkins over their arms and that sort of thing. And the other one uses a lot of instrumental type music, with vocal sounds, imitate the instruments. We work a little bit of that in there as well to show the sorts of music that they do. And we keep coming back to the main song, Harmony, in between. But the other thing that we wanted to do was show what it was like for them as a group that achieved great fame in 1930s Germany, and 3 of the 6 members were Jewish. And so as the years went by in the 30s, we got closer to the 40s. They went from being a celebrated group that Germany was proud of in their performances around the world to having greater and greater restrictions as to what they could do, simply because 3 members were Jewish and the main arranger was Jewish. And so, as you know, those things became more and more restrictive. They suffered persecution, and ultimately led to the group needing to disband because 3 of them had to flee the country to save their lives. So we wanted to portray that, from the very beginnings, the excitement and the great heights that they achieved as performers, adored by audiences, through escalating tensions and restrictions until then we get into the second song. Is very powerful ballad that talks about through all the horrors that can happen in the world, somehow the stars in the sky keep shining. There's a constant and there's a hope that comes from that. I think we will give the audience a good idea of what this group was like, what they achieved, and what they went through, and consequently why we know so little about them now. As you could probably tell from what I've just described, it's a little bit different than a typical arranging project for a barbershop group going into contest. Typically, the 2 songs tend not to be related on the same theme, although sometimes that happens. But this is very much not just in the same theme, but this is a mini musical that is based on music from Harmony, but we tried to use that to tell a more historically accurate story about the Canadian harmonists. So that means you can't put the same sort of creativity into it because you're bound by the importance and the accuracy of the story that you're telling. And you have this overall story arc that is of utmost importance. Essentially, at the end of the ballad, the music continues because there's narrative woven throughout to help with the storytelling. And the music continues a little bit beyond the end of the ballad, so the story can be wrapped up. We can learn a little bit about what happened to each of the harmonists, feel a sense of loss, what they went through, and the tragedy of us not knowing anything about them. I think that's what we're hoping people will take away from it, that they'll, number one, they'll learn who the Canadian harmonists were. They'll have an appreciation for what their story was, how great they were, what was taken from them and taken from us. I hope they fall in love with them and feel the loss that they are not known in the world, even in the world of harmony singers such as us. And I guess at the end of the day, if there's a little bit of a lesson in there about the importance of harmony, not just musical harmony, but harmony and interaction with each other, what that represents, that would be a good thing for the world. We can't reach the entire world, but maybe we can reach a little corner of it. That's what we're hoping for. Thanks for listening. I hope that you get to watch this performance in July. I think it'll be very exciting.